Second. And we're live. Welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller, and today we have a very special program. I'm very excited about this. We have Dr. William Rees on, and I've been following his work, and those of you who've been following me for a really long time know I did a program on his work a few years ago when it was only Clubhouse. But we're going to be talking about ecological footprint, climate change, overshoot, and all those kinds of things. But first, just a few quick program notes. Please like, subscribe, and follow the program so more people see it. That's really important to spread the word about climate and what we should be doing about it. Upcoming programs. Next week, we have water expert Peter Glick, who some of you might recall we've interviewed him before. Then we have a kind of a different thing the week after. We have Michael Greenberg from Climate Defiance, who does direct climate action, get in your face climate action. And then in early April, we have Dana Fisher, author of Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. So those are some program notes. Bill, welcome. Welcome to Climate Chat. I'm so excited to have you here. I think a lot of people would know you, but you're going to be new to some others. So maybe you could give us just a little bit of your background and what brought you to studying ecological footprint.
Okay, thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. I started out in my academic career as a population ecologist. I studied birds. This is going way back to the 1960s at the University of Toronto. Was really interested, however, as the environmental movement got way in human ecology. And I quickly discovered that there was no such thing in biology departments. Humans were simply not considered to be part of ecosystems. In fact, I was once challenged by a very senior American ecologist for sullying the waters by trying to bring humans into the picture. This is an example in academic circles of what we call exceptionalism. The idea that humans aren't really part of nature and therefore we don't have to pay much attention to natural laws and all of that sort of thing. At any rate, I was very interested in becoming a human ecologist. Couldn't find a job in any North American university where I would be in a zoology department studying human beings. But I did get an invitation from the University of British Columbia to start a human ecology or human planning program based on ecological principles in the School of Community and Regional Planning. So that's where I went. And shortly after I arrived there as a wet behind-the-ear population ecologist, I was invited to give a short seminar to an assembly of senior colleagues at the university on any topic of my interest. And I suppose in my ignorance, I chose a topic that was guaranteed at the time to get me in trouble. And it was on the notion of human carrying capacity. So I gave this little talk and I did a quick and dirty calculation of the carrying capacity, the number of people that could live permanently in the lower mainland of British Columbia, where I live, without seriously damaging their own habitat. That's basically what carrying capacity means. And it was politely enough received. By the way, my number came to about 35 or 40,000, something like that, under extreme conditions of low consumption. There were already over 1 million people living there. So yeah. I immediately ran into trouble. And after my paper, a senior economist at UBC came to me and said, look, Bill, I know you're well-intentioned. You're probably not a stupid fellow, but you just made a fool of yourself in front of some very senior people at this university. Economists long ago abolished the term of human carrying capacity. It has no relevance to human beings because, after all, we can trade. So the reason there's 1 million people living in this area is that we bring stuff in from all over the rest of Canada, the US, the world, and so on. And moreover, there's technology. Human ingenuity is the only real resource. And everything humans challenged by, we can overcome. So he had the perfect argument. And by the way, I'd never heard these arguments as a biologist before. For abolishing the concept of carrying capacity. And in fact, he used at one point the term, we seem to be, what was it, dematerializing or decoupling from nature. Mm-hmm. So there's just no reason to be concerned about questions of human carrying capacity. Well, I went away from that meeting with my tail between my legs. Probably a year later, I woke up in the middle of the night with a aha bulb glowing above my head because I thought I had a way of countering this argument. Now, keep in mind, I had a whole year here of thinking I don't have anything to say. These guys have got it all wrapped up. Technology solves the day, trade abolishes my concept. But I just couldn't get away from thinking that it's got to be nonsense that humans aren't connected in some way to the planet. So I decided to look at this not from the way economists do. Everything they do is monetary analysis. But what happens if we look at real material flows? So I asked myself a very simple question. Let me put it in a slightly different way. If you can imagine a small planet with everything exactly the same as functions on Earth, but just large enough to support one human being in the material style to which you are accustomed, how large would that planet have to be? So what would the productive capacity of that little tiny planetoid be? How much arable land would there be? How much forest land would there be? How much assimilative land to absorb and recycle your wastes would there be? So I thought, this is something we could estimate. So I began to look at the whole question of how much land it takes. And I think of this as now the first question of human ecology. How much of the Earth's surface is needed to support just me at whatever specified material standard I select?
Mm-hmm.
And that became, over time, the ecological footprint. We've developed a method for doing this using data from the United Nations and every national government, and we've worked it through. So it turns out that's the origin of the ecological footprint. And it completely turns on its head the economist's argument, because, of course, the people in the lower mainland of British Columbia, which, by the way, is now over approaching 3 million, I guess, don't live here ecologically. We live on goods and services imported from productive lands and waters elsewhere. And any densely populated region can say the same. They don't really live in that region. Here's something that got me into trouble with my planning friends. I said, when you look at it this way, human cities are the human equivalent of livestock feedlots, densely populated areas with huge numbers of particular organism. But the land that supports those organisms is not in the feedlot. If you've got a cattle feedlot of 100,000 animals, there's something like, millions of acres of grazing land out there supporting those animals. So that's the eco footprint idea. It's
great. That's a great intro and a great summary, actually. So that's fantastic. So I heard you talk about this. So this is I want my audience to hear. What's the ecological footprint? Let's pick like Tokyo, the Netherlands, the U.S., and the globe.
My goodness. Let's start with the Netherlands. It's a very interesting case because the Netherlands was actually one of the first countries we looked at way back in the early 80s. And I was invited to a conference in Amsterdam by the Dutch government to present the results of this study. They'd given us free access to all their data and so on. And interestingly, this was a conference put on for third world delegates who were struggling to find better ways of developing. And the speaker before me on the podium was a Dutch economist who argued that they had no better example to follow than Holland. Because here was Holland, this tiny little country, the most densely populated country in Europe at the time, I believe. And yet it had an enormously profitable enterprise in every dimension. In fact, Holland was even a net exporter of food products. So if a little tiny overpopulated so-called country like the Netherlands could do it, surely it was an example for every other country to follow. Well, I nearly fell out of my chair. I was right beside this guy because one of the things we had demonstrated in our study was that the Dutch people don't really live in Holland. At the time, our numbers might have been a little different from the way we look at it now. But in order to have a surplus in agricultural exports, is how he put it, this is done in monetary terms. So what does Holland export? Very expensive value-added products like cheese, canned meats, and so on and so forth. But the fodder used to grow those products, to grow the animals and so on within the Netherlands is mostly based on fodder imported from elsewhere. And it turned out that something like 3 or 4 times as much land outside of Holland was being used just to raise these animals, let alone all the human beings and so on and so forth. So I was able to say to this same audience that Holland would be the last example that you'd want to follow, because it was dependent on many of your countries for imports of food to feed the animal population in Holland. And of course, any country running, by the way, that means Holland's running an ecological deficit. It's using vastly more ecological capital outside of its country than is contained within its domestic boundaries. Well, for every country that's living on imports, there has to be exporting countries with ecological surpluses. Mm-hmm. So not every country could be a country like Holland running an ecological deficit. And that was my look at Holland. So Holland has a footprint 5 or 7 times larger. I'm just thinking off the top of my head now from memory than Holland itself. If you look at Tokyo, Tokyo is an amazing city because it has something like 38 or 39 million people. That's almost the entire population of Canada within one metropolitan area. But the ecological footprint of the average Japanese is something like 4 hectares. That's what, 10 acres. And so you've got a situation in which Japan could not support even its capital city of Tokyo on its domestic biocapacity. So Tokyo and Japan, again, like the Netherlands, is one of those countries that runs a vast ecological deficit with the rest of the planet, both in terms of importing foodstuffs and lumber and so on, and in terms of the assimilative capacity required elsewhere to assimilate the waste products of Japanese industry and so on. So, yeah.
Okay. How about the U.S.? The U.S., we have a lot of empty land in the U.S., so I'm wondering where we are on that.
It's a great question. I once remember getting in an argument with an economist from the Fraser Institute here in Vancouver, which is similar to the Cato Institute in Washington, and both the Cato Institute and the Fraser Institute in Vancouver have argued that the United States is empty. Anybody, in fact, one of the quotes that was thrown at me, anybody who's flown over the country in an aircraft can see just by looking outside that the countryside is virtually empty. We could, expand indefinitely. One group of economists, by the way, estimate we could have a population of 1 trillion people on the planet without pushing the limits. Well, this is nonsense, of course, because that land that seems to be empty is actually occupied because all of it is producing goods and services, ecological goods and services, from agricultural to forest products to groundwater, in the service of the people that are concentrated in the city. So the U.S. too, if you add in the carbon footprint, is running a slight deficit with the rest of the world.
And how about, very importantly, how about the entire Earth? How many Earths are we using? I know the number from before. I'm not sure what the current number is.
Well, we're probably using the equivalent of about 1.7 times the current Earth. So if we wanted to live sustainably at current levels of consumption, just average levels of consumption, we need a planet almost twice as big as the planet is now. Now, I sometimes speak to school children, and even the little ones go, well, how could we be on a planet that's smaller than the one we've got? And the answer is because we're drawing down the accumulated capital of Earth. So fisheries are in decline. We've displaced something like 70% of vertebrate populations. Humans have gone from less than 1% of the biomass of mammals on Earth to something like 34%. And if we throw in our domestic animals, also needed to sustain us, then humans and their domestic animals are something like 96, 97% of the biomass of mammals. So all the rest have been displaced. So we're literally destroying the co-occupants of planet Earth by the expansion of the human enterprise. And some people just don't believe that. They say, well, look at all the herd animals in Africa and so on. Well, think of the bison of North America and the pronghorns. There used to be anywhere between 40 and 60 million bison on the Great Plains, and an almost equivalent number of pronghorns, certainly tens of millions, and so on. I could list the whole zoo full of animals that used to live out there. Well, they're not there any longer, but they've been replaced ecologically in terms of the biomass by an equivalent biomass of human beings living in Canada, the United States, and the rest of the world, because we are food exporters. So what we've seen with the growth of the human enterprise is the gradual displacement from their habitats of most other mammals. And it's the same with birds. 70% of the biomass of birds today on planet Earth are domestic fowl, not wild birds, which are in precipitous decline along with insects and so on. So yeah, we're living on a planet and we seem to be doing just fine, but it's because we're literally destroying the savings in our ecological bank account. It's as if your uncle left you $1 million. If you could invest your $1 million at 5% per year, and then you could live quite happily indefinitely on a $50,000 a year income. But as soon as you go to 60,000 or 70 or 80, you start drawing down your capital. It doesn't return as much interest. And within a few years, you find an SF check comes back and you're out of the game. And that's where we're headed. Earth is in a state of advanced ecological overshoot. And that's what ecological print analysis shows us. We're living by depleting the stored capital of planet Earth.
So I guess it begs the question, what's your thoughts on how much time we have as a functioning civilization before these, until the shit hits the fan, I guess is the technical term. But so what's your thoughts on that?
Look, I never try to make predictions. I like to describe where we are. So let me set it up so that people can make their own predictions. Right now, if we're 70% in overshoot, fisheries are declining, soils are being eroded anywhere from 10 to 40 times faster than they can regenerate. The U.S. even is losing its groundwater supplies. There's great concern about the Ogallala Reservoir aquifer drying up. Certain rivers no longer, etc. You get the picture. Again, this is all because we're depleting resources faster than they can regenerate. In fact, that's the definition of overshoot. Overshoot is that state in which the consumers are depleting and consuming and destroying their essential assets faster than those assets can regenerate. So that's what we're doing on planet Earth. Now, meanwhile, economists look at none of these things, are arguing that we should be growing at 2 to 3% per year, which means doubling the scale of the world economy in the next anywhere from 23 to 35 years, let's say. Now, if doubling the scale of the economy, by which we mean doubling per capita GDP, equates to even a 50% increase in material consumption, then add that to the current state of drawdown of our natural capital. And let me throw in something else here. Keep in mind that the current state of overshoot is really the result of consumption by only a third or a quarter of the world's people, the wealthy folks, you and me, and probably everybody in this audience are in that category. 2/3 of the world's people are living in a materially unsatisfactory way, at least as far as we were concerned. There's 1 billion people who have no energy, energy to speak of, no artificial energy beyond their food supplies still. So all of these people are struggling, and totally justifiably, to rise to the same material standard that we would have. So that would require increasing the productivity of the planet by a factor of 4 to 8, something like that, and perhaps 5 at least if we come up to North American standard. Well, I just don't see that being possible given the current rate of collapse of ecosystem. Climate change is ruinous, and we can't make these increased gains in the economy on renewable energy. It will be done and is being done with fossil fuel. We're still 80% dependent on fossil fuel. So everything we're doing to raise the world's population to levels comparable to, say, Europe or North America is accelerating and extending overshoot. So that I argue the collapse will probably happen within this century, but I'm not going to.
Okay, within the century. Okay.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned climate change, and you've said multiple times that climate change is a huge problem. It's really a symptom of overshoot. It's not a distinct Can you just maybe spend just a minute on that? Why you think climate change is not a separate problem?
One of the problems with the human mind is that we don't think in systematic terms. The
Mhm.
human brain evolved under very simple conditions. If you go back to Paleolithic times, and by the way, our brain achieved this size about 1.5 million years ago, and nothing much has changed since. In fact, we've shrunk a little bit, if you want to know the truth of it.
Mm.
But the bottom line is this, that we evolved in relatively simple environments where you would expect to meet no more than a few dozen, maybe 150 people in your entire lifetime. You lived in a
Mm.
relatively restricted home range. You probably died within a few kilometers or miles of the place you were born. And the environment over the course of your lifetime would be relatively constant. Yeah, there'd be seasonal changes and so on and so forth, but that's about it. So in effect, the environment in which he involved posed relatively few challenges to the developing human brain. So we learned to think in simple terms. We learned to think in nonlinear terms, just absolute, or rather in linear terms. We think of one thing at a time. Most people
Mhm.
can't think of more than one thing at a time. And so one of the consequences of this is our tendency to be reductionist. We break everything down into the finest little bits and pieces. So climate change is like that. And climate change, let's throw in biodiversity loss, plunging biodiversity. I've already talked a little bit about that.
Mm.
Ocean acidification, soils and land degradation. We've ruined already more than a third, maybe as much as a half of the original agricultural land on the planet. We can go on and on. We can talk about tropical deforestation. We can talk about the reversion or conversion of forests, which were once sinks for carbon dioxide, have now become sources because we're
Mhm.
harvesting so much. The soils are decomposing, adding carbon to the atmosphere. We've managed forests in ways that they're prone to fire. 2 years ago, the forest fires in Canada, I know you hear a lot about them in California, but we've had comparable fires.
Mhm. Well,
The
absolutely.
fires in our boreal forests produce more carbon dioxide than all of the nations on the world, except perhaps China and the United States. So that was a huge contribution, vastly larger than the contribution by Canadians burning fossil fuel. So we've turned some of our major carbon sinks that once assimilated carbon into sources, and that's accelerating. This is a feedback mechanism that's accelerating the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the bottom line is that all of these things are symptoms of the same problem. There are too many people consuming and polluting too much. Climate
Mhm.
change, the portion of it driven by carbon dioxide emissions, is a waste management problem.
Yes.
People don't really think again systematically, but if you think of carbon dioxide, the byproduct or the product, really the major product,
Mhm.
apart from energy burning fossil fuels, that's the single largest waste product by weight from major industrial
Right.
economies. Now, most people
2.5
don't.
trillion tons
That's
so
right.
far.
So that's right. 37, 38, maybe 40 billion tons per year
Year
going
per
into the
year.
atmosphere. Yeah. So it's a huge waste problem, but we tend to think of it separately from the problem of overshoot. But it's one of the principal symptoms of too many people consuming and polluting too much. It used to be that the amount of combustion undertaken by human beings could easily be accommodated by the ecosphere by
Mhm.
burning a little bit of coal and a little bit of wood and so on. Uh, Big deal. Carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, it's assimilated by growing forests somewhere. Well, that's no longer the case. So we've
Mhm.
turned what used to be sources, well, into bigger sources, and what used to be sinks into sources themselves, and hence compounding the problem. So climate change is a horrific issue. I'm not for a moment suggesting it's not a
Mm.
major issue, but I am suggesting that we're making it worse by what we are doing to defeat it, by
Right.
separating it out, by looking at it as an isolated problem to be solved, and then trying to solve it in our normal knee-jerk fashion of looking at new technologies to maintain the growth engine. We're
Right.
actually doing two things. First of all, I should back up a little bit here. Um, people tend to think of something called the energy transition.
Right. I was about to ask you about that.
Okay,
Okay.
so what does that imply to the normal mind? You see, we create images that we like to believe in. A transition means you go from one thing to another thing. But if you look at a profile of energy use, the kinds of energy we've used since the early, say, 18th century, back then it was primarily biomass. People burned wood,
Mhm.
and in many places they burn animal dung. In fact, they still do
Mhm.
elsewhere. Okay, so
Yep.
biomass energy was the big deal until, say, the early 19th century. Then we caught on to coal. Coal grew right through the 19th century, but somewhere along the way we added petroleum. And petroleum has been the mainstay since the beginning of the 20th century. But then natural gas came on in the middle of the, and then nuclear and hydropower and so on and so forth. And if you stack all of these together, you see an exponential increase in energy use in the world, which, by the way, corresponds to the growth of the economy and the growth of the human population. They're all exponential and they're all tightly tied together because it's
Mm.
energy that
Sure.
enables population and economic growth. But the bottom line is this, that we are using today more biomass energy, wood and animal dung and so on, than we were back in 1800. So on top of that, we've added an enormous amount of coal, which, by the way, is still growing. On top of that, we added petroleum. On top of that, we've added a natural gas, which is still growing. So as we add so-called renewable energy, it's not displacing anything. There's no transition taking place. It's
Yep.
simply being added to the stack. And even though we tend to think in terms of the enormous growth of the solar energy and wind energy domain on the planet in the last years, there's no question about it. It goes up 10, 15, some years
Right.
even more than that percent. But it starts from a very small base. And it's only electricity. And electricity is only 20% of the world's final energy supply. So in effect, with all of this growth, the last year for which I have numbers is 2023, wind and solar combined provided only about 3.7% of the world's final energy
Final
consumption. And
energy.
that's after a couple of decades of astonishing and admittedly astonishing growth. But the point again is that that's 3%, 3.5%, maybe let's say now it's 5%. You still got that other very large area to go. We're not going to reach net zero anything by 2050. And in fact,
Mm.
think of it in these terms. Right now, the demand for energy globally, even the demand for electricity, vastly exceeds the rate at which we can add more renewable energy. So where's the difference coming up? It's fossil fuel.
No, I see.
So let me, okay, so very simply put, we're adding, yes, we're adding too, but not
No,
replacing.
I totally agree, by the way.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
tell
yeah.
people when you see those graphs showing renewables shooting through coal, in terms of percentage of total energy, maybe for electricity, of course,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, they see that as being a chart showing how good we're doing. I said, no, it's a terrible graph. It shows we're screwed because the fossil fuels is continuing along. Maybe it's not going
That's
up
right.
very fast, but that's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter how much renewables. And so I do agree with you that the way we're doing it, which is subsidizing renewables, it doesn't work because what do? You get more renewables. Okay, yeah, we got more, but we don't have less fossil fuels. But there is a possible world where the policy, rather than subsidizing renewables, is to phase out fossil fuels on a strict timeline. Of course, we're not going. I mean, the amazing thing about this policy is it's not even discussed. It's
Oh,
like not
well,
you're not allowed to bring it up in polite company. But let's say we did that. My understanding is that the amount of material, stuff we need to build 100% renewable world, is about 4 times the amount of stuff we extract today minus fossil fuels. But fossil fuels are 500 times more than 4 times all the other stuff right now. And therefore, if we did, and again, it's obviously the biggest if in the world, if we did phase out fossil fuels, that would result in a 99% reduction in total extraction. So what's your thoughts on that? If we had that policy, would that be positive for our fight to survive?
Again, that's a really complicated question because there's a difference in the quality of the materials being recovered here. If you think of the batteries for electric vehicles, for instance,
Yep.
or the rare minerals required to construct modern wind turbines, you have to mine several hundred tons to get a couple of ounces of whatever. I don't even know the names of all of these things. And the residues of these mining processes are often extremely toxic in ways that residues of fossil fuels are also toxic. Carbon dioxide, for example, in a sense, toxic in a different way in the climate sense. But so it's a very different operation that we're talking about. And there's something else to keep in mind here. You talk about phasing out fossil fuels. Most of the mining, refining, transportation, manufacturing, installation, and operation of renewable energy can only be achieved with fossil fuels.
Well, why? Why can it only be?
Because because of the natures of these processes. Fossil fuels have incredible energy density, for one thing. So they can, with ease, reach temperatures that it's very difficult to reach in many industrial processes with electricity alone. There's some attempts to have steel production by electricity, but a couple of the major producers have abandoned those because they simply don't work. They're just too costly. So anyway, but that's not the real point. The real point here is that if we were to abandon fossil fuels when we're 80% dependent on fossil fuels, you cannot name a product from your computers to your oranges that aren't to some degree, and often to a very large degree, fossil fuel dependent. Every major city, if you look at every major city in the United States, if you were to stand on a major highway coming into that city in the morning, it's a steady stream of trucks. And those trucks are bringing that which is required by the millions of people living in that city to survive that day. This goes on day in and day out. Diesel fuel is the heartblood, or the blood, really, of industrial economies. There's no real progress as yet, despite everything we've heard from Elon Musk, on getting the fleet of highway transportation electrified. The battery technology simply isn't there in the scale that is required.
Oh no, obviously. By the way, of course,
Okay.
no disagreement whatsoever. I'm
Okay, so
talking
look,
about a world. Let's pick a number. 30 years from now, where we started today, which of course we're not starting today, but we start today and we phase it out, so everyone knows. You're not going to be able to buy diesel, pick a number, 15 years from now. And so the trucks start phasing out. And it's a transition, not a switch from one day to the next. So, or the thought experiment is, what if fossil fuels just didn't exist? Would we figure out how to do other things? Yeah, we would figure it out. It might be hard to do arc furnaces, but we could make them work if we put our.
But how much time are you talking about? Typically, it takes a couple of decades
Oh
to
yeah.
go from a thought experiment to a lab bench to something that actually works in the real world. So if fossil fuels simply disappeared right now, you'd be condemning
Oh yeah, no, of course,
7 or 8 billion people to a painful death. And I'm afraid that's the way I see it for the next few decades. We're simply not going to phase out of fossil fuel because we can't without collapsing the economies. Okay. And certainly if you look at your current president with his drill baby drill notions, he believes it. I'm not supportive of Trump in any way, shape, or form, but that is an idea that is out there. And certainly people who study fossil fuel, the role of fossil fuels in the economy, recognize that. Each American, each Canadian has working for us 24/7, somewhere between 50 and 100 so-called energy slaves. So the human equivalent of 50 to 100 other individuals working 24/7 to produce the goods and services that each of us consumes on a daily basis. That's all being done by fossil fuel.
Right.
Take half of that and your lifestyle plummets. So phasing out, what do we mean by that? We're going to phase out of fossil fuels because we're going to run out of of economically exploitable sources of oil and gas in particular. Coal, maybe not so much. And by the way, coal is regaining its foothold because people realize that in many respects, attempting to go all green has been a failure.
Well,
And for all
UK got
sorts of
rid of coal altogether, I believe, or at least they have.
who?
The United Kingdom, didn't they like get off of coal?
No,
Denmark's,
no. Again, people confuse energy with electricity.
so they're
Okay.
still using coal for heat and things like that.
Well, what drives the diesel-powered lorries on the highways and their automobiles? It's mostly fossil
Oh
fuel.
no, 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 fossil fuel. I'm sorry, just I meant coal specifically.
Oh, coal.
Um,
Yeah. So what?
oh, okay, okay.
And
No, no, I agree. We're you know, it's
I don't
we're
know
in
what
this
the situ
crazy situation where, well, I want to get, we
Well,
had a
a
little
few
chat
years
about,
ago, you have to look at again the big picture here. I don't know if it's still true, to be honest, but a few years ago, a study showed that the UK's very rapid uh, reduction in its domestic carbon emissions was the result of the offshoring of industry
yeah.
to other places. So if you're importing all your automobiles from China or the United States or wherever, then the fossil fuel contribution to the manufacture and the mining and all of that, so
Hmm.
is happening over there. There's a good reason why China is the world's most polluted nation. There's a good reason why China is the greatest producer of carbon dioxide. And it's because they become the manufacturing part of the industrial globe, including much of US and Canadian manufacturing. It's offshore to China.
Hmm. Okay. By the way, it's kind of related to all of this, but one thing we've talked a lot about on the show is the rebound effect that people think that when I making things more efficient um, saves you energy and saves you emissions. What are your thoughts on energy efficiency leading to reductions in greenhouse gases or other forms of pollution?
Well, this is one of the greatest myths of industrial societies, and it really goes back to the 19th century when Jevons, a British
Hmm.
economist, Britain was rapidly industrializing, and somebody raised concerns about the supply of coal. So again, coal was the fuel of the Industrial
Sure,
Revolution.
of course.
So Jevons undertook a study. The idea was that if British industry got much more efficient in the use of coal, then the pressure on coal supplies would decline. And what Jevons found was completely the opposite. Because as machines got more efficient, as steam engines got more efficient, the costs of running them was reduced. And that meant more and more industries could take advantage of steam engines and other
Hmm.
sources of energy supplied by coal. And
Hmm.
that meant that as the efficiency increased, the demand for coal increased. And so both coal supplies and emissions increased lockstep with efficiency. It's now called the Jevons effect, the rebound effect.
Yeah.
A simple example, supposing you've been accustomed to keeping your house at, oh, I don't know, what's your temperature? 70?
72
Oh,
degrees.
72. Okay. But a lot of people would keep it at, say, 68 to save
Correct.
energy, but they get a much more efficient furnace. So
Yeah.
now, okay, they're not going to keep their temperature at 68, they're going to go to 72. And the
Oh yeah.
efficiency gains of the furnace have been consumed by higher rates of fuel use because they now can take advantage of that more efficient fuel. The same with
The,
automobiles. Cars in the United States get about the same mileage as they did in 1920. So the efficiency of the engines
wow.
has greatly increased, but we've increased the power by a factor of 4 or 5 or something like
Hmm.
that, so that we're still using as much fuel per kilometer or mile as ever. Yeah.
But I understand that the big one of the big rebound effects is that yes, if you okay, let's take a car, you make it more fuel efficient, and so therefore, for driving the same distance, you use a little less fuel. But first of all, now you're going to drive more often alone than maybe you would
That's
have, or you're going to also drive longer and
Or
things.
you go
So
on a
so
longer holiday, or you
that's
can
the
afford a
direct.
second car for the kids or whatever. So
Well, that's the thing. So it's that's the direct effect. But also, let's say you save a ton of money on it. Let's say it's three
how did
thousand
you say?
dollars that year. now you're going to take a trip to Spain or something like
Yeah,
that. And
exactly.
that's the real rebound effect. Like when you look at the Earth as a system, the more efficient you make that system, which more fuel efficient cars make it more, then it ends up using more energy in the whole system,
Yeah,
and
it's the
therefore
same. Yeah,
creates more greenhouse gases. So
yeah.
yeah, so I've come to the conclusion, and I find I'm in the uh, climate investment community of venture capital. And I would say, in my mind, I'm not sure if this is not a statistic or anything, but about a third of the companies you see are energy efficiency companies. And I see everyone, I bring this up, AI. I mean, people think they're going to make AI better by making it more efficient. That for sure will lead to more energy use with Jevons. But so I get people, they don't disagree with you, but they also ignore it. That's why my other question for you is, what you talk about in terms of ecological footprint is taught in every high school biology class, right? We learn about this. This is obviously true for species, non-human species, and we learn about ecological collapse of local ecosystem. We learn about. No one disagrees with that, right? But when it comes to your work, where you say humans have limits and humans have an ecological footprint, what is obviously not everyone's following your work. I mean, well, not everyone's agreeing with your work. Do they, one, disagree, or two, like the venture capitalists do, ignore it?
Well, some ignore it. There's three categories. Some are ignorant of it completely. Some
Okay.
know about it and ignore it. Some simply don't believe it. They have counter arguments. So there's a whole domain of people out there called eco-modernists.
Okay.
So there's environmental problems, we have ecological problems, but we have the technology to solve these problems.
Hmm.
So they accept that there are issues, but they simply forge ahead on grounds that, again, many economists believe that human ingenuity is the greatest resource. There's lots of evidence for the power of human ingenuity. I'm not for a moment challenging that. But the assumption here is that we can safely not ignore these problems, but that once we confront them, we will solve them. And
Hmm.
therefore, we just go forward. I've had countless arguments with eco-modernists in the press and so on over the eco footprint. They misinterpret it in many respects. For example, they say you're not accounting for new technologies that might reduce this, that, or something else. And I say, well, of course we're not, because they don't exist yet. The ecological footprint is a snapshot of what's happening right now using the technologies right now. But if you introduce a new technology and it has a significant effect on the material flows through the system, then the ecological footprint method will pick that up. But you
Hmm.
can't ask me to support something that hasn't happened yet using a model that has to depend on real world data right now. And that's what it's not a predictive tool. It's simply a snapshot of current circumstances or circumstances at the time the analysis. So if we shifted, to take your wish list there, to a totally green energy system, what would the effect of that be on per capita consumption? And we could then plug the new data, the material flows consumed in that year, into the ecological footprint model, and we would come up with the answer. Here's the effect of your technology. We'll compare today with yesterday. Has there been an improvement? And if we were to do that, keep in mind, people forget we've gone through the last half century of unprecedented efficiency gains. Everything is more efficient. I'm speaking to
Hmm.
you on a computer that has more computing power, my little laptop, than the entire University of Toronto did when I was a graduate student.
Absolutely. Probably by
Okay,
probably several orders of magnitude.
absolutely. The same with your cell phone is a magnificent example of enormous efficiency gains. Now,
Mm.
some economists actually have used that example to throw at me. How do you mean? Well, look at the computer, tiny little space, not much material. Yeah, but there's 37 billion of these things now using an enormous amount of electricity and so on and so forth. It's your
Absolutely. They're
rebound effect.
everywhere. They're like you probably look around, you won't even realize how many
That's
computers
right.
are in your room right now.
So the point I'm getting at is that
Hmm.
every gain in material and technological efficiency has made it easier for us to consume more and more of those things and a lot of other stuff at the same time. The human economy during this period of 5 decades of ever increasing efficiency has become ever more consuming of resources everywhere. And it's not just population growth, obviously.
Now, so there's ecological collapse if we, stay at this level of overconsumption for too long. And then there's climate change, which is a symptom, it's the pollution from all of that activity in form of CO2, mostly, but methane and other things. And yet we're approaching, some climate scientists tell us we're approaching tipping points. For example, the Atlantic Ocean current could begin to shut down in literally 20 to 30 years, which would, and also temperature rise itself in the past has caused mass extinctions. In addition to our own like denuding the forest kind of things to hurt species, also just temperature rise alone. So we could be in a position where climate change lowers the productive capacity of our planet or shifts everything around, so we're screwed that way. One of the ways to address that is, theoretically, is solar radiation management. Solar geoengineering goes by a bunch of different names. I've heard on one of your other interviews that you said that that wasn't a good thing or wouldn't work, but I didn't get to hear why. So what are your thoughts on solar geoengineering as not the only solution to climate change, but just buying us some time so we can start to do the right things?
This is a long conversation, Dan, a long conversation. Okay, first of all, we don't have the time. Any solar engineering project of the scale necessary to have a significant effect would take decades, and we don't have decades.
Okay.
Secondly, we're dealing here with systems of inordinate complexity. You talked about tipping points. Complex systems are characterized by lags, thresholds, and tipping points. A threshold is the point at which a little minor change can flip the system into a completely different domain of stability, so to speak. We've been doing massive experiments on that scale with the planet Earth already. We haven't done it on purpose, but fossil fuel use is an example of a huge intervention in a very complex system that is pushing it toward tipping points.
Correct.
When you start talking about geoengineering and the manipulation of the solar input into the planet, we have no idea what the consequences of that are likely to be. Again, we think in simple terms. Oh, there's too much insulation. Let's block some of it out. So that's that simple, primitive mindset of single cause-effect relationship, when in fact there are layers and layers and layers of causal feedbacks and relationships that would be impacted by any such thing. So I just don't think we have the intelligence. I don't think we have the knowledge. I don't think we have the analytic capacity to anticipate the impact of any major geoengineering scheme. So we don't have the time. B, it could be extremely dangerous. C, why don't we get serious about the real causes of this problem, which is too many people consuming and polluting too much.
Oh, well, actually, so that leads directly into I guess the major question is, what do you think we can and should be doing to address not just climate, but the old overshoot, and let's throw climate in, because if the climate causes civilization to collapse, which could happen anywhere between 2 and 4 degrees of warming. That's also the same as just running out of stuff. I mean, we won't be here.
Okay.
So what are your thoughts on what we should do?
Let's look at climate, because again, as I said, I think it's a major problem. But we're not solving the problem, Dan. What we're doing to address climate is not fixing the climate, and it's extending overshoot. What we are doing is not fixing the climate, and it's extending overshoot. If I have a graph, I should have brought it along, but if you were to look at, I can say this, I suppose, in simple words. In 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. 1992, that's 33 years ago. In that period of time, there have been 29 so-called COP conferences, the conference of the parties that was set up under the Climate Convention back in, okay, so we've had 29 of these things. There's been any number of warnings, scientists' warnings on the climate situation and other impacts of human beings on the planet. So over that 32-year period, dedicated under the UN Climate Convention, of which the US is no longer a part, apparently, we have been doing everything that we have thought about to reduce carbon emissions. And during that period, carbon emissions have continued to grow at an accelerating or exponential pace. We're burning 60 to 70% more fossil fuel now than when we formed the Climate Convention. And that's after 29 major international conferences dedicated to reducing emissions. Human beings have used more than half the fossil fuels ever consumed by the whole of the human enterprise in just the last 30 years or so. So nothing we have done, while presumably dedicated to resolving the climate issue, has had any effect whatsoever. Well, it may have reduced the emissions that would have happened otherwise. But if the goal was to reduce the emissions and to reduce atmospheric concentrations, we failed miserably.
Absolutely.
So that's right. So I'm saying again, let me repeat, what we are doing to address climate change is not fixing the climate.
No, no. By the way, anyone who listens to this show knows that that's all we talk about. We're not Kevin Anderson. You may know the climate scientist in the UK. He says we're choosing to fail.
Exactly.
And I totally, we're not doing anything. Well, I mean, yes, I agree that maybe we're reducing how bad it might have gotten, but it doesn't really matter. We're not seriously addressing.
The way to fix the climate is to address its cause, overshoot. And the only way to fix overshoot, by definition, again, let's define it. Overshoot means that we are consuming even renewable resources, even replenishable resources, faster than they can regenerate. And we're dumping wastes in excess of the quantities that nature can assimilate. It's very simple. So how do you deal with that? You reduce consumption and you reduce waste production. How do you do that? You have to reduce the amount of what is called economic throughput. The materials going into the economy have to be greatly reduced. And you can't do that with efficiency alone, although efficiency works if we do one other thing, and I'll get to that in a minute. And you have to reduce pollution. But if you reduce inputs, you also reduce outputs automatically. The less you eat, the less you'll poop, so to speak. Now, let's go back to the efficiency question. Supposing we became twice as efficient in our use of fossil fuels as we are now. In theory, we could keep doing what we are doing right now with half as much fossil fuel, which would be a great thing. But in order for that to happen, we'd have to double the price of fossil fuel. So efficiency works if you combine it with something called ecological tax reform.
Right.
So if you make it much more expensive to use the fossil fuel, then doubling its efficiency would mean that you could still get the same service out of the use of fossil fuel with half as much, but you'd be paying the same because we've doubled the price. Okay. So if we increase the costs of goods and services in proportion to the increase in the efficiency of the use of materials, efficiency would work. The rebound effect only works because you save money, which you then spend on something else or more of the same thing. Okay. So let's start over again. Unsustainability, the ecological crisis, climate change, these are all collective problems, meaning we are all in this together. We're in the same boat. Collective problems require collective solutions. You cannot, as an individual, fix climate change. You cannot, as an individual, increase the efficiency of fossil fuel use. You cannot, as an individual, make your city have a much better transportation system. You cannot, as an individual, implement a set of ecological tax reforms that would bring goods and services up to their real costs of production. All of those things have to be done on behalf of the common good or the public interest by governments. in our collective interest. I'm sorry. And of course, all of that, everything I've just said is completely flying in the face of everything going on in your country right now.
Absolutely.
And elsewhere as we're moving
Well,
to
really the whole world. I mean, is there any
yeah, but
examples of people doing really
yeah,
well in
there
this
are.
area?
There are, yeah, sure.
Okay.
The Scandinavian countries and so on, much more so than we are at any rate.
Okay.
If you look at those
Sure.
nations, several of those countries have much better performance statistics in every single measure of population and general health than does the United States, for example. The US is
Oh,
the greatest country on the planet, but you've got declining longevity. Even in Canada, longevity is now 80 years, it's 76 years in the US and getting worse. And I don't want to get into the whole
well,
statistics.
that's also politics. It's not necessarily. For example,
But
Norway
we're
is
talking
has
about
the North
politics.
Sea, right?
We're talking about politics. And
Oh,
what I'm
that's true.
saying is that if you want to solve these problems, we have to take it on as a community. It has to be collective pain for future gain.
Humans don't seem to be very interested in that
Of
whatsoever.
course they aren't, because we've been mentally trained to think in different ways. So here's another problem with the human primitive brain. Human beings don't take reality as it comes. We make up stories about it. Sociologists call this the social construction of reality.
Hmm.
So if you think of religious doctrines, economic paradigms, political ideologies, even scientific theories, they're all products of the human mind. They look at some aspect of reality, they make up a story about it. We see if it feels good, and then we discuss it among ourselves and we accept it. Even the scientific process is exactly that. I publish an idea, it goes to a peer-reviewed journal, my colleagues review it, they come back at me, say that's bullshit, or this should do that. And then we come to an agreement, yeah, okay, that's a good idea as it stands, until the next better idea comes along. But my point is, this is a social process by which we construct our views of reality.
Yes.
Now, the right wing has understood this far better than leftists. So they've constructed a view of what civilization in, say, the United States to be. And they've sold this through advertising, through the development of think tanks. Look, a friend of mine some years ago did a study of the rise in right-wing think tanks and their sources of funding over the United States since the Reagan administration. No, the Nixon administration back in the 70s. And there's been an exponential increase in the amount of money going into the creation of organizations such as the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, dedicated to proclamating commercial values, corporate values, to eliminating the concept of the public good, the common good. You never hear those terms any longer in US political discourse, because purposefully been subjected to a systematic attempt to reshape political dialogue in ways that offload responsibility onto the individual. Everybody's for individual rights and freedoms. It's your responsibility to reduce your carbon emissions.
Right, yeah.
Let's
British
excuse
Petroleum, came up with
that's
that.
right.
Yeah.
Excuse the companies and so on. So to me, that's part of our problem here. And it's why people
Oh,
resist
sure.
the kind of language I'm talking about, because we have a mindset that rejects it. Here's another thing to think about. When an idea or an experience is repeated over and over and over again, and this is what happens in our education system, in our popular media, and so on and so forth. The more you hear something, the more it becomes embedded in synaptic circuits in the
Yeah.
brain. There's a good little book on this called Brain and Culture by Bruce Wexler.
Yeah, we just had David Fenton on, who's an expert in communication. He
Okay.
repeats that all the time. Short
Okay,
messages repeated often. Yeah.
That's right. So then they become embedded. And once you have this little automatic program running in the brain on its own synaptic circuits, it tends to be a filter through which you absorb every bit of new information. And if that new information reinforces your pre-existing circuitry, all for it. People seek out experiences and people that reinforce that which they already have come to believe. But we reject, deny, forget, or simply ignore counter information. So to many people, maybe even some listening today, they all think I'm crazy, but they have to ask themselves, what is the basis for what I am saying? Is there some scientific, factual basis for the kinds of arguments I'm making? And are they rejecting them simply because it makes them feel uncomfortable, given how they have been trained to think by our education system, by billions of dollars of advertising, by the rhetoric that goes on as an excuse for political discourse these days, which is totally nonsense. So that's the trouble. We have a primitive brain. We have a primitive way of perceiving reality that is simply maladapted to the
Yeah,
complex circumstances that we live in today.
I know. I totally agree. I've done shows on that, in fact. But so you're bringing up the Enlightenment fallacy as well, though. We don't base decisions on information. We do it on emotion, which is why all those think tanks work so well, right? They get people to vote against their own interests because they know how to trigger emotions about people going to invade you or whatever, whatever the
Whatever.
latest
Yeah.
small issue is, distract you from the big issue. So given that, well, first of all, so we have to use less. What about population? You didn't specifically mention that today, I think,
Well,
about what we have to do with population.
that's another area that's been turned into a taboo subject.
Hmm.
Even the United Nations now says that 8 billion people is evidence of human greatness and success. There's no problem. We can go to 10 without an issue. There's a statement that says no country should be in support of population planning. Well, to my
Wow.
mind, again, you see, that's the UN, but it's the United States. It's most countries. Russia, if we take one of your new friends, Russia. Russia in November last year passed a law that would imprison somebody for promoting the virtues of small families.
Oh,
You can no longer discuss or promote the virtues of being single and not having children.
I think they need more
So,
soldiers, so I think I
well,
understand the
that
reasoning
may be,
behind that.
well, that's not far from the argument economists use either. We need more and more people to maintain
Mm.
the workforce, to maintain, the pension funds and so on and so forth. Yeah, those are problems. But are they bigger problems than the collapse of the ecosphere as a result of too many people? Because again, keep in mind that the current state of overshoot, which is causing climate change, which is causing fisheries collapses, the erosion of soils, the drawing down of water, that's just 1/4 or a third at best of the world's people causing those
Mm.
impacts. So if we want to bring up the rest of the world to our standards, it means a 5-fold increase in material and energy consumption. And then you add another 2 billion people, and that's another, doubling again. So this just
What?
doesn't
Okay.
work on a finite planet.
But
Population has got to be part of this picture. Most countries today are promoting what is called pronatalism. In other words, if you have a big family, you get a reward. The government pays baby bonuses or checks to mothers who are productive. Let's get women back in the kitchen and barefoot and pregnant. That seems to be
but
the
but
underlying theme of economists around the world. Yeah.
yes, but the reason they're doing that is because birth rates are dropping in all the developed nations, like Italy and the United States. We're only maintaining population through immigration, which might change soon. Who
Well,
knows?
it's the same in Canada. But that you see again, if you were living in my mind, this is cause for celebration. This
Oh
is cause
yeah,
for
no, I'm saying isn't
celebration.
that a
Okay,
good thing? Isn't that a good
it's
thing?
not. Yeah.
That
Wait a
when you
minute.
reach a
Are
certain
the
level of economic satisfaction, that you don't have to have as many children because you don't need someone, if you're half your children are going to die, you want someone to take care of you in your old age, you're going to need a lot of, but if you feel protected and healthy and whatever, and a lot of other factors. So I was just wondering what you thought. So you just recognize that as a good thing, but it's not working overall in the
No, it's not
earth
working overall,
level.
and we're trying to defeat it. I think it's really important. If I were going to say where should population be most heavily controlled, it really is in countries that are now peaking and beginning to decline. One American, one Canadian is the equivalent of 10 or 15 people in a very poor country. So if one of us doesn't have a child, that's the equivalent of 10 people not being put in place in some other country. So we need to, think of this in these broader terms. We should be celebrating the peaking of population and adapting socially to these other issues that it's raising. Workforce, well, what about robotics? If everybody's enthusiastic about that, maybe we don't need a whole bunch more workers.
Yeah.
You're talking about pension plans. Listen, how is income distribution working out for you in the United States? Where the rich 1% are taking, what, 80% of national income growth? That's absurd. Spread it around. There's all sorts of social instruments available to sustain a population, even one that's in decline. Japan has figured this out.
So that's what you outlined at a high level what we should do. I guess reduce population, use less stuff. Okay, very simple, by the way, very easy to understand. We're not even thinking of doing any of those. I mean, you're not even, as you found out, you're not even allowed to talk about doing those things, at least
Absolutely.
some of those things. Actually, all of it. The degrowth movement, there's interesting people talking about it, but it's not a mainstream subject at all. And what is the famous saying is people can much more easily imagine the destruction of civilization than they can imagine the destruction of economic growth or something like that. So any thoughts on what would actually get through to people I mean, obviously climate damage and ecological damage is going to wake people up, starting to wake people up, I would say. They're obviously, as we found out in our country, not fully awake yet, as we saw in the election. But what are your thoughts on real things we always in quotes on the we can do to get the public or policymakers behind the idea of doing what we need to do to save civilization?
Well, again, this is a very long conversation. I started academic life believing that better information led to better decisions.
Right.
And then I've, completely abandoned that prospect because we've never had better information than we have today, and it has almost no effect on the policy directive. So I've come, hardly an original thought. I don't believe that there's an example anywhere where people voluntarily give up something good in order to benefit the environment. Maybe one or two do here and there. There's a voluntary simplicity movement, but as you say, it's trivial. Even a degrowth movement, which is a kind of a formal way of trying to suggest we need simpler lifestyles, less materially intense. They don't touch the population issue. That's still taboo for them.
Oh.
So yeah, it's true. So what's going to wake people up is catastrophe. Historically, it seems to me that we need most people who are in positions to be able to do something to be personally affected very negatively before they're moved to doing anything. Look, you don't live a sustainable lifestyle. I certainly don't live a sustainable lifestyle. And I raised this at a meeting one time of colleagues, environmentalists, and so on. I said, look, when all of you and I are wearing hair shirt, we have a right to go out and tell other people to reduce but we won't. And there are not many, at least a couple I'm aware of academic studies that show that if you compare people who are extremely well informed about environmental impacts at a certain income level with a group of people, a large group of people who have no information whatsoever and couldn't give a damn about the environment at the same income level, there's virtually no difference in spending patterns.
Really?
People
Wow.
tend to, again, there are individual exceptions, but en masse, no, we don't. I don't think the environmental community is any more, don't have smaller footprints necessarily than do the public at large. So we don't tend to act on our own knowledge. And why should we? There's something called the public good free rider problem. If I gave up all of my material well-being, it would make a contribution to the world. That's a public good. Everybody benefits a little tiny bit from my contribution. I take the entire hit. It's my sacrifice to live in the cold in a tent in the backyard. But I don't get anything more than that infinitesimal tiny share of the benefits of my giving up my lifestyle. So why should I? I'm not going to, most of us won't do it. countries say the same thing. The United States won't participate if China doesn't participate. Why should we give up this if China doesn't give up? And so we've got this intellectual problem that, again, is because we fractured us into these little tiny national states. And so this is a global problem requiring collective solutions on the part of everybody, where we come to agreement about the nature of the problems and we solve them collectively so that we share the pain as well as the future gain. That's not going to happen voluntarily, apparently, because we've been arguing about it for 50 years. Will probably make a big difference. It's one of two things: either some major catastrophic flip in climate. You mentioned the point about
AMOC. Yeah,
that's right. A tipping point is where the whole system changes into a different quality. And the AMOC, the North Atlantic Meridian, overturning circulation.
Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation. Ocean conveyor belt.
That's right, which would tend to put Europe in a deep freeze in a time of global warming, ironically, would have a major impact on people in Europe. They might then begin to say, hey, this is actually serious. Another thing that's likely to happen, if ordinary people want change, it's revolution in the street, or at least civil uprising on a huge scale, unprecedented scale. There's a wonderful little paper written a few years ago by a US billionaire called "The Pitchforks Are Coming." He was writing it, so he was simply arguing, look, if we carry on like this, appropriating more and more of the nation's wealth, well, more and more people go hungry and homeless, then there will be a revolution. And that's what has, in the past, made major social changes occur.
Civilizations collapse, whenever there's big income inequality,
And you've raised another very important point on civilization collapse. I was going to try to avoid this, but let's get into it a bit. There's several books and many studies now of the progression of a civilization. And we're at I would say, the peak and beginning to disassemble point of a civilizational history. They start out simply, we grow, we get innovative, we're very resilient, and then bureaucracies start to settle in, and people become less and less convinced that the system is on their side, and oligarchs emerge, and wealthy people take more and more and people become disenchanted at the popular level. And the country gets more and more complex, and so on. So Joseph Tainter's book is called The Collapse of Complex Societies. And he argues a point is finally reached where that civilization, which has managed to solve all of its problems to date, is hit by the next big problem. But it's so disunified, or so disorganized, that the bureaucracy is corrupt, the elites are looking out for themselves, ordinary people have lost confidence in the instruments of government, and so on and so forth. When the next big crisis hits, down it goes. It can go fast or slow. And I think that's what's beginning to happen in the Western world. We got fat and lazy. We've allowed bureaucrats to congest the system. We've allowed the elites to appropriate most of the national wealth in many of our countries. And other people are feeling increasingly left astray. Homelessness is increasing, and they lose confidence in governance. And so when the next crisis comes, will we be able to cope with the collapse of the climate system? Will we be able to cope with the collapse of the energy system? If we can't find a substitute for fossil fuel in the time available, and we can't supply our major cities, there will be mass migrations into the countryside. People will starve first, of course, and riot in the streets. But my point is, we're at a point now where we can look forward to an unraveling of our kind of civilization.
I don't know, looking forward would be the right terminology, but
yes, you get my point.
I get your point. But so would you consider yourself a doomer?
No, I'm a realist. I get into this argument all the time. People, you're not very optimistic. Listen, optimism and pessimism are states of mind that don't necessarily have any anchor in reality. All I try to do is look at the real situation. What do the data tell us about the state of affairs? What do the trends show us about the directions we're headed? And if you look at the trends, they are all going toward some kind of catalysmic point, a tipping point, if you will, not only in climate, but in ecosystems terms, in terms of popular disenchantment. All of these are complex systems that, are stable within certain domains of variability. But then once you push it a little too far, all hell breaks loose. And we don't know what, but that's a really good point to think of, by the way. When you reach a tipping point, you don't know it's there until you've crossed it.
Exactly.
And by the time you've crossed it, it's too late to go back. The system may have changed for all intents and purposes permanently, at least in terms of human timescale. So we're messing with systems whose complexity far outweighs the capacity of our primitive little human minds to wrap around. Nobody understands the human economy, really. Nobody gets the internet. Look at the struggles we're having now over AI. Some people think it's the greatest thing since cream cheese. Others who are terrified at its prospects. We don't understand what's going on or what the ramifications of AI really are any more than we understood the impact of fossil fuel on civilization.
Totally agree. That's true. So if we do have this, if we get a tipping point on AMOC, by the way, the freezing Europe is like the least of our problems. It lowers rainfall across the entire northern hemisphere and screws up all these other things. So that would definitely lower population. It's similar, really, in a way, to what you were saying. If we shut off fossil fuels like really, really quickly,
absolutely.
So that will lower population. That's one way to get to where we need to get to. I guess it's not the right way to do it, but
no, of course not. But for 50 years. Dan, look, we have known what we should be doing.
Right? Absolutely.
There's no need to, if we had begun 50 years ago to look seriously at the human population question, if we had made birth control freely available, along with family planning education to the women of the world, had we devised development programs that increased female economic independence in many of the world's fast-growing nations, we wouldn't have a population crisis today. But we know the things that need to be done, but we ignored them. Again, it goes back to our entire conversation.
Yeah, primitive brains.
That's right. We are not, contrary to popular belief, human beings are not primarily or even remotely rational species.
Absolutely.
We respond from instinct, we respond from emotion, and we respond out of these socially constructed ideas that may have no anchor in reality. It's entirely possible to live your life out of a belief set that has no basis in fact. A very simple example. Even 700 years ago, the world is flat. You wouldn't get any debate about that. Everybody knew that it was bullshit. But it didn't matter that you lived your life thinking the world was flat, because it was an adequate first approximation of reality. It was an adequate description of how people experience their lives. And there are many, many examples of that kind where you have a completely discombobulated or fabricated, a fantastic vision of what life is about. You could live your life through, and it wouldn't make any difference. But today, we've developed a concept of living that is at such odds with the nature of biophysical reality that the biophysical reality will destroy us. Simple example, economic models. The world today is being run by a form of economics called neoliberal economics. There are different versions of it. Even the Chinese are onto it now as a communist country. But basically, it starts with models that separate the economy from the environment. So that's a huge conceptual error right there.
Right.
Secondly, it says, well, yeah, there are some residual connections. We do extract resources from the environment, but the real resource is human ingenuity. And human beings are smart enough to discover any substitute for any natural resource that we run out of. So if you believe that the economy and the ecosphere are separate, and you believe human ingenuity can solve any residual problems, you believe profoundly in perpetual growth, because there's nothing to constrain you. So our whole economic system is based on a set of assumptions and presumptions that are not anchored to any biophysical reality. So we have the separateness notion out there. And by the way, since it's failing, since pollution is a big problem, and we are running out of, we talk now about dematerialization. It's another social construct, okay? So while economists and other techno-optimists, I mentioned the eco-modernist crowd, believe we're capable of detaching from nature, the reality is we're becoming ever increasingly embedded in, dependent on, and a part of nature.
Of course.
So that sometime early in this decade, I think the total mass of human artifacts on the planet exceeded the mass of living things. We've reached the
Well,
point where
CO2 already is 2.5 trillion tons.
sure.
Total weight of all.
I'm just talking about our built enterprise. And if
Right.
we talked a bit about moving stuff around. Look, human movement of material in the mining and petroleum exploitation is vastly larger than the amount of movement of material caused by natural forces of erosion and so on and so forth. So we've become the major geological force changing the face of Earth. And yet we live out of an economic fantasy that we're dematerializing and decoupling and not part of nature in any case. So again, you
we're
could have
decoupling from reality, I think is maybe the right
exactly
phrase.
so. Okay, I've rattled on enough.
No, it's just so I just want to. So one solution, I guess, quote, big quotes around the solution, is to allow. Well, it's not allowing. It is that climate damage, ecological damage play out and have a devastating impact on human population and maybe also wake us up to living within our means. So instead of 8 billion people, we're down to 2 or 3 or something, whatever it is. And then maybe, but the problem is, see, there's another problem, is that, yes, there's a renewable capacity of the Earth, but CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands. I heard Stefan Ramsdorff say 10,000 years, in the atmosphere. So when you stop putting it up there, it doesn't get better, and then we'll be at this elevated temperature.
But if you
Any
stop
thoughts on? Yeah, go ahead.
if you stop putting it up there, you can stabilize the atmosphere, at least at its current concentrations. So
Correct.
that you can halt.
If we're lucky, we're lucky.
Yeah, if you're lucky, because we've now put in place a bunch of positive feedback things.
Exactly.
So you get burning of forests because of
Permafrost,
which puts a lot of
yeah.
particulate matter into the atmosphere. One of your guests has pointed out that accelerates the melting of ice in the polar regions, which of course adds to this North Atlantic haline problem that we talked about earlier, and reduces the amount of reflective surface. And so that accelerates heating once again. So we've put in place a number of these positive feedbacks that may reduce the effect of even stopping the use of fossil fuels.
Correct.
So it may already be too late to do anything about it. On the other hand, it may not. So again, I keep coming back to the reality that were we to choose to do so, put some of this human ingenuity to use in deciding how, as a human species, we can best save ourselves on the planet and reduce the population. It's going to be catastrophic. There will be the loss of billions of people. But does that have to be painful and egregious, or can we do it in at least help to soften the blow? And there are many ways in which we can do that. But as you
Well,
said,
there's a lot of easy ways to do it now if we did it in a productive, policy-focused way, but we don't seem willing to even talk about it. You did mention, how the Republicans have these think tanks that have changed the way we think. Do you see a possibility of people based somewhat in reality about the predicament we're in, being able to change the way we think maybe over a little bit of time, but then maybe get there before the catastrophe hits? Do you think that's a possibility?
No.
Okay.
It's a possibility. Let's say
Well,
that
yeah,
it
okay.
is possible
Everything's...
for the human mind to be manipulated in a different direction. The probability, that is to say, the likelihood of it happening is remote for a very simple reason. The think tanks are sponsored by people with billions of dollars. What you're doing in the United States right now is destroying the scientific community. So
it's insane.
That's right. So my point is that the advertising sector, those think tanks we talked about that have manipulated the public discourse around political decision making, All of those things cost billions of dollars. The other community is the scientific community, producing the facts of the matter, which fly in the face of what the oligarchs would have you do. And what they're doing right now, as I understand it, is reducing the capacity of this scientific establishment in the United States even to put up a decent argument. So I think, yeah, sorry, just to go back to your question, it's possible, but it ain't happening.
Well, by the way, I have I don't call it a prediction, I call it a possible scenario that these actions that the Trump administration is taking will tank the American and global economy, and that will end up reducing emissions. Do you see any possible silver linings? And again, not people will not be happy about that. I'm not suggesting they would be, but there are a lot of unintended consequences when you go down the path of trying to screw around with the economy. So
absolutely, and I agree with your scenario. That's an entire possibility. But again, you see, I'm a humanist to this extent. There are two ways to go down. One is with dignity and with a certain degree of compassion, not only for other human beings, but for other species and for the state of the planet. The other way is through a catastrophic decline, in which we're at each other's throat, in which war breaks out, in which millions of people or hundreds of millions of people will die poisonous deaths. And I prefer
which
the
one do you
former
choose?
to the latter, yeah.
Well, I always tell people it's sort of we have a choice between like doing the right thing and the wrong thing is you have a choice of winning the lottery or being waterboarded. Which do you choose? And everyone's choosing waterboarding. It's like, what? Wait a second. And
Yeah,
I mean, I agree, of course, with all you're saying about that. I have a million more questions for you, but I would like to open it up to others to ask you some questions. So we have our co-mod Stacy. If you're there, Stacy, you can pop up and ask your own question, and maybe you have some questions from the YouTube audience as well.
Yes. Hi.
hi,
So good to
Stacey.
have you here. And are you William or Bill?
Both of those. And
Okay.
I've been called much worse.
Well, it's so good to have you here, Bill.
Thank you.
It's like, oh my gosh, I should have signaled to Elliot to be here because he
Elliot Jacobson is actually, by the way, our most popular show in terms of viewership was Conversation with a Doomer, which is Elliot Jacobson, and
Yeah.
his belief is that it's a good thing to let things go because that'll protect nature. Screw human beings, but it'll protect nature. So, but anyway, let's move on from that. And
Yeah.
what's your question?
Anyway, so I have a couple, just a few quick comments for me and what it was great chatter on YouTube, and then questions. And I'll try to go as quickly as possible. So the last one first, birth control. You said that would have been a wise thing to do, but nations, since we are sadly divided up into all these little pockets, it's the same as religion. We want more of us. It's like this, we have to keep the thing going, it's like we have to be on top of it, and we need soldiers.
Right, Russian
That's it.
soldiers.
We need workers in the factory, and those are the things that are controlling it. I loved the example, or I mean, we've talked about it so many times about Jevons paradox and data storage and stuff, and I had my own example. My son, his laptop broke, okay? And it's like, okay, well, I will upgrade my computer and then give him mine, and then we'll get him a new laptop when he goes to college in the fall. And it's like, if you rewind back to when I was going to college, it was like, oh, the school has a computer lab, like, woo, like the whole idea that you would have your own computer or that his would break and boom, I'm going to go get one, as opposed to this being, like I planned for months when I got my first computer, saving, to get this. And now it's just like, oh, we just go get one. Anyway, that and the data storage, everything, all the efficiencies, we we used to have floppies this big, like they were
I
a
was
thing that,
there.
yeah, and you put them in the machine. Now it's like I'm afraid of wiping my laptop. So I go on Amazon and I'm gonna get a hard drive that's gonna back up the whole thing just in case I miss something. It's it's like I bike everywhere. I try to be as good as possible, but even still, I'm in this society where it's like, oh, I just blah, 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 and go get one. These things that were so precious and rare when I was younger. Anyway, and then the last comment was you said one person can't change the transportation system for the city. And I laughed because I thought you were talking at me. And I don't crush my dreams because
Okay.
I do want to change the transportation system here in San Francisco. And
Okay.
yeah, I will likely expire trying, but
Well,
I
you can
carry on.
lobby to do that, but you will not personally implement the policies needed to fix San Francisco's transportation system.
Oh, I
And
applied to be the director.
oh, I
I'm
see.
not qualified. I'm just an armchair director type,
Okay.
but I applied anyway.
Let's go
Um,
together the questions now.
Yeah, okay. So my question is, and you kind of danced around this here, and it's been a point of contention with like some of our regulars with Leon and others, the orange one. How, like, we had enough problems sort of modeling what might happen based on all of the different inputs that go into the the climate and our whole environment. Now we have things like, we talked about population, and we have someone who is making, I don't know, he's up to 15 kids of his own or whatever. They're taking away abortion, but they're also implementing tariffs, which are going to collapse economies pretty much if they really stick to it. And also, if he could pull it off and we did more of our manufacturing here, we wouldn't be shipping so much. And it's just, but we have gross income inequality that's only going to get distorted more. What's your take on what is the outcome of the biggest um, country footprint that there is, the United States?
My goodness. That, again, that's a question we could spend the whole day talking about. Look, on tariffs and so on, I'm a believer that every region should be as self-reliant as possible. There was an old phrase, I think, way back in the early part of the 19th century, used in North America. It was called, it went like this: trade if necessary, but not necessarily trade. And I think that makes a great deal of sense. I think every country, every region should be as food self-sufficient as possible. Every country, every region should be as self-sufficient in the basic necessities of life as possible: clothing, small appliances, and so on and so forth. That said, it makes no sense whatsoever for every country to be absolutely self-reliant and say big things like automobiles or whatever, if we got to have them. So there are enormous efficiency gains to be made by allowing what's called Ricardian trade theory to work. So if the United States can manufacture automobiles more efficiently than China, then maybe it should manufacture cars for both China and the United States. If China can manufacture computers more efficiently than the United States, then it should make computers for both China and the United States, and you trade your computers for your cars. That's a nice fair exchange, and the world uses, in theory, less material because each country is doing that which it does most efficiently. So yeah, there's good reasons for trade. There's good reasons for not trade that have to do with security when, if push comes to shove, or if there's a breakdown in global transportation. No country in Europe could survive these days without global transportation. Japan could not survive without global fossil fuel transportation. So we've made ourselves into a world of interconnectedness of such extent that it's all put in jeopardy by the abandonment of fossil fuels in the absence of a good substitute. We've become dependent on a system that is not sustainable. We've become dependent on a system that's only not sustainable, but for which there are no ready substitutes on the horizon. And then I fall back on my final position is, even if there were, it would be not necessarily a good thing in the long run, because it would merely maintain what I call business as usual growth, which is ecosphere destroying by alternative means, growth by alternative means. So
Okay. that is one of the things that you said that led to the most points of contention
What's that?
with our viewers. And that is that the notion that we can't do this via renewables. And I understand there is a time constraint in terms of the transition and the trade-off, but people were citing Mark Jacobson, Kevin Anderson, Saul Griffith as people that you do, and then and I guess you agree with Derek Jensen is what they're, who I'm not familiar with, but the others I was, in terms of the take on ecologic damage of green energy. But there are many people in the green energy camp who say we can do this. Do you know their viewpoints, or have you discussed or worked with them at all?
I know their
Kevin, Mark,
viewpoints. Yeah, I know. Listen, Jacobson's study I know quite well. I know the criticisms of it as well. But again, you have to ask yourself, is it happening? Is it happening the way that they've been saying for 20 years it would happen? And I'm saying, no, it is not. That the reality is fossil fuel use is increasing much faster than we can bring wind and solar power on stream. There's a myth out there that wind and solar power is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. But that's not a whole picture analysis. What's getting cheaper is the manufacturing process. And much of that's because it's being done with cheap labor in China. China is making most of our wind and solar power equipment. So, but the point of the matter is that the technical word is penetration. The greater the penetration of wind and solar into national grids, the more expensive it gets. Because once wind and solar become a major part of your supply, you get into a situation where reliability of the grid system is called into question. Wind and solar are, well, what's the word?
Intermittent.
Intermittent, exactly. If the
But batteries are getting way cheaper.
But, of course they
already.
But, cheaper, but still extremely expensive. And
they're replacing gas peaker plants. I mean, already, and that's separate from wind and solar, right?
Yeah, and what's happening to the costs of electricity? If you just plot the costs, the domestic costs of electricity against the degree of penetration of wind and solar in the world's nations, the most expensive electricity is in those places that have.
Isn't that good though? Isn't it good to have high energy prices? That's what you're arguing for.
Fine, but don't tell me it's getting cheaper. That's my point.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so it's
well. By the way, I think we have to be very careful because I totally agree with what you're saying. But we're talking about a world in which we're phasing out fossil fuels as opposed to just adding. Yeah, we're not. Of course not.
We're not. So again, I keep saying, don't tell me about what could have happened if we'd done this, or what should happen if we did that, or what might happen if we do something else. What is happening right now?
No, I totally agree.
True, but wait a minute. Bill, the one thing there in terms of the cost, I think this is actually something that's kind of right. Like the cost of generating energy via renewables is going down. The cost to the end consumer for electricity is going up. And that, I think by everything you said before, is a good thing because it's making
but you can't argue that it's but I think by the way the cost in California is because of fire and things like that
right.
Prices going up.
That's one factor. Yeah. Stacey, yes, I'd like to double energy prices, but that's not what they're saying. What you're arguing is everything is cheaper and we can replace fossil fuels. We can't. It's not happening.
We're not. Absolutely, we're not.
Listen, we're going to go. Listen, we are headed toward the kind of economy that uses much less energy, but it won't be voluntary. It'll be because of the fall off in fossil fuel use, which is a good thing, and the incapacity of the alternatives to replace that in quantity. Okay, certainly at the time available. Look, people talk about net zero by 2050. How far away is that now?
25 years.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Total joke.
Okay, so it ain't going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, we're going to see accelerating climate change. We're headed for 2.7 or 3 degrees Celsius
or more
global warming, which is absolutely catastrophic. Absolutely. So I'm sorry, it's just not happening in time to do anything to avoid that kind of
The
critical.
number 2 on the list, and one of the things, another replacement. What are your thoughts on animal agriculture?
What about it?
Well, what should we do? Or what do you think? Do you think that can help us enough?
Getting rid of animals.
Getting rid of animal agriculture.
Animal agriculture is a factor, but it's only a factor, and it's not going to be the salvation that everybody would. Everybody has a pet thing that's going to solve all our problems, and if we did all of them simultaneously, it might get us somewhere. But animal agriculture per se is not going to solve all of our problems. And by the way, a little bit of reality. Again, I don't. It's one thing to say if we got rid of animal agriculture, carbon emissions would be reduced by X%. What's happening in the real world? The real world shows that as incomes rise on the planet, animal agriculture becomes an increasing part of everybody's diet. That's the real world. And until you make it impossible for people to afford to eat meat, they will continue to eat meat. That's just the nature of reality. That's the nature of reality. And by the way, I'm not going to get into the moral and ethical dimensions of this, but the human body evolved as an omnivorous species where we eat a lot of plants and we should eat some animal matter. So I don't even think it's a good idea to abandon animal matter. We could eat far less, yes. But again, I just go back to the real world data. The prices are such that, and incomes are rising such that, as incomes increase in the developing world, the consumption of meat increases. That's what people do when they can afford to eat meat.
So the last one I have is in terms of, so that sort of makes it sound like degrowth and reducing income inequality are probably our best bets moving forward.
If we were to make a concerted culture-wide or nationwide commitment to degrowth, it would require a much greater equity, much higher taxation of the rich, and redistribution of the benefits of that to poor people, or you would see a die-off, a catastrophic die-off of poor people. The fact of the matter is, the planet's overpopulated, and more people are consuming, pardon me, fewer and fewer people are consuming more and more of the nation's wealth. And the United States is showing us the way in that direction. What is it now? Something like 60 billionaires have the same wealth as half of the world's population. It may even be worse now. Well, that's just egregiously ridiculous. That just shouldn't be supported in any civilized. We're not a civilized. That's just primitive accumulation.
I totally agree. And it ties in with somebody said having one fewer child is equivalent to convincing 22 people to never drive a car. I will have to stat check that, but it's probably right. Yeah.
Well, that's the number one thing you do for your carbon footprint is have a child, of course, right? Right. But yeah, and the top 1% of the population emits twice as much greenhouse gases as the bottom 50%, twice as much as the bottom 50%.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. So,
but again, listen, I really, Dan, I have to halt you on that point.
Okay.
But keep in mind that everyone aspires. We have created a world in which people aspire to increasing their consumption. Everyone aspires to increasing their use of fossil fuel, essentially. And so the statistic you cite is correct, but we are doing nothing to reduce that reality, and everything we can to ensure that more and more people have higher and higher incomes to consume more and more. And that's not really a good thing from the ecological perspective. And you could say, well, who gives a shit about the planet? Let it go down. We're having fun in the meantime. And that was what many civilizations in the past have done as they fell into the rat hole.
I guess so. Thank you, Stacy. And Eli, what's your question?
Well, so a lot of points here. First, just in connection with what you mentioned a minute ago, the Trump administration just rejected the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're turning the ship in the exact opposite direction that you mentioned. We being the United States official policy. But I just taking a broad overview of the discussion, I want to note strong agreement that ecological restoration is essential alongside climate restoration. But in my highly informed opinion, we face non-negligible risks of climate runaway, even if we had achieved net zero in 2020. Earlier, you reduced humanism to choosing a mode of fatalism, and taking technological advances off the table rather cements that. Your asserted intractability of complex systems is at the core of this fatalism. The intractability of addressing climate and ecological disruption thus far is due to political interests and structures, not lack of understanding. And I will note something you might find interesting. The only model with explicit phosphorus and nitrogen cycles, model of soil carbon uptake, shows the lowest level of soil carbon uptake. We understand how to analyze these systems, but there's resistance even among climate scientists. Now, Dan mentioned solar radiation management, and as I mentioned just now, we have these risks of runaway that people want to ignore, no matter what we do. Essentially, going forward, we could have done differently in 1990, but we've painted ourselves into this corner. But the uncertainty that you asserted regarding SRM, there's also at least as much uncertainty regarding amplifying feedbacks. Space-based solar radiation management is more feasible than widely appreciated, and is also dynamically controllable, so it can be modulated in the event of unanticipated responses. And I think more attention into other alternatives like that is part of the resolution of this impasse that you've essentially created, that only leaves the option of, how do we undertake human decline? The terms in the ecological footprint equation are population size, average requirements, and net resource utilization efficiency. Civilizational infrastructure based on closed loop industrial ecology precisely addresses the issue of material fluxes at the core of your analysis. We don't have that because it's not the cheapest, easiest infrastructure to build under resource constraints, and resource constraints are effectively socioeconomically reproduced along with the social construction of mandatory growth, which is both a product and requirement of the existing societal infrastructure. So, I've kind of assaulted your entire analysis. I would like to hear your response.
Well, good heavens, I've spent 2 hours now talking.
Maybe a quick overview.
Well, listen here. We obviously have different perspectives on this. Every major technological advance we have made has a yin and a yang phenomenon. There are benefits and there are costs. And at present, in terms of the integrity of the ecosphere, the costs are outweighing the benefits. And the system is beginning to deteriorate rapidly. I think, and you've made the point yourself, that we're dealing with exceedingly complex systems here. You mentioned solar radiation control having the capacity to withdraw if things go awry, but we're dealing with complex systems, and once things have gone awry, backing off may not be adequate. If we've gone past a climate tipping point, backing off in our use of fossil fuel isn't going to change the fact that the climate will continue to unravel for decades, if not centuries ahead. So I think we're at a point where we simply don't know the unknown unknowns, to use a famous phrase. We have no idea what we're doing in the manipulation of major systems. And another thing I think I want to touch on the way by is the, frankly, impossibility of the so-called circular economy. First of all, energy is the heart, the beating heart of every economic system. The growth of the human economy is lockstep, 99% explained by the use of energy and the increased availability of energy supply. So we've got a situation where we're utterly dependent for everything we do and in the future on that continuous flow of energy. But energy cannot be recycled. Energy is used once. It's a unidirectional throughput system. So there's no recycling of energy. And the idea of a circular economy based on energy is, first of all, theoretically impossible in terms of the energy itself. Secondly, every attempt to recycle is not efficient, at least not 100% efficient. We're only recycling, what, about 15% of our material resources right now. And even if you tried to go to 100%, there's a theoretical maximum to the amount of material that can be recycled in a system. It degrades, it breaks down according to the second law of thermodynamics. So there's no 100% recycling possible of material goods. Secondly, if you double the scale of the economy, then you double the amount of housing, automobiles, and all of that side of stuff. And any amount of recycling won't compensate for that. So if you're going to continue to grow, even if you're recycling at the maximum efficiency rate, you are not recycling any energy. And you're still doubling your economic throughput of material goods if you double the scale of the economy. So again, I think the whole idea of the circular economy, obviously we should recycle some things, but it's not the solution to the problem by any stretch of the imagination. It's a theoretical possibility on thermodynamic grounds alone.
So regarding energy, I will just mention that one of our previous guests, Klaus Lackner, in 1995, wrote a paper. It's Lackner and Wendt regarding the self-replicating manufacture of photovoltaics and the amount of area it would require under that analyzed system to provide for the electricity needs of the United States. It turns out to be a very small area. I would suggest you dig up that paper. It's worth a read.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But
also, I think
again, it doesn't matter. I don't give a damn about. Look, first of all, if you look around the world, a huge amount of area of good land is being taken up by wind and solar, and people are getting pissed off. So that's a whole other issue. Even if you're right in the thing that you've just said, my problem with it is that all you're doing is business as usual by alternative means. You're not addressing the fundamental problem of excessive material and energy throughput in the global economy that is undermining the structural and functional integrity of the ecosphere. And there are too many people who want to climb on the energy and material bandwagon that we've all enjoyed. And that a quarter of the world's people have managed to deplete, the entire planet. So I'm sorry, I cannot buy these futuristic arguments in the face of the evidence.
Well, I would suggest that this is a bit of conclusion-based reasoning. So I hope you will explore other alternatives.
Okay, thanks, Eli. We have one question from a Zoom audience member, Dr. Brian. Welcome. What's your question for Bill?
Thank you, and William. Great to hear your perspective on this. Tony Seba has once said that basically no incumbent technology can survive an order of magnitude cost reduction. He cites as an example precision fermentation or protein, which cost $100 a kilo in 2020, $10 a kilo in 2025, and projected $1 per kilo in 2030. There's a 10x advantage in milk today in terms of milk protein. There's a 10x advantage in beef in 2030. In terms of 80% replacement of some of our protein sources, he and George Monbiot cite two order of magnitude replacements in precision fermentation requiring approximately 50 times less land area to provide protein to the world's population. I'd like to get your perspective on these technological benefits and the prospect and the fact that when it is 10 times cheaper, people do switch. Thanks.
Well, again, look, I don't have a lot of confidence in the Tony Seba approach to the world because it is a technological fix to maintain and increase the status quo. So feeding 10 times as many people with artificial proteins isn't going to solve the basic problems confronting the integrity of the ecosphere. I'm sorry. So that's all very well, and perhaps it would be a wonderful kind of technology to have if there were 500 million or 1 billion people on the planet, but it's not going to open the future in ways that I can see.
I do have a response to this, and that is because it'll use 50 times less land area, we can actually rewild most farmland in the world. And so we've seen this already in Queensland, where I live, and elsewhere as well. So, I mean, this factor of 50 and orders of magnitude, I mean, there's a lot of rewilding that's possible under this scenario.
Oh, but that's fair enough. If those factors actually work out in reality at commercial scale. It's one thing to demonstrate something, and it's like nuclear fusion. As long as I've been alive, I've heard about not fusion, nuclear fission. No, fusion, it's fusion. Nuclear fusion was going to save humanity. It's just around the corner. And because they have some little experiment or even some big experiment that for 1/10 of a second works to show that it's feasible. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's capable of being extrapolated to commercial use in any reasonable time frame. And I think the same goes for the technologies you're talking about. A few years ago, artificial meat production was heralded with the same kinds of numbers you're talking about. It's made almost no dent in the commercial marketplace because it's too expensive, it's too energy rich, it's too complex to keep going. When I was a kid, there was a huge experiment in Japan to use large fermentation tanks of algae, because algae could produce at much more rapid rates than any other process to produce protein for human consumption. But it was all abandoned. And one of the reasons was that the algal tanks invariably became infected by useful species, bacterial or other kinds of infections, and the cost went through the roof. And bottom line, it doesn't work at scale. And so I'm waiting. I mean, I don't object at all to displacement of animal agriculture by suitable forms of alternatives. It's just not happening in the time frame and at the commercial scale in ways that ordinary people could afford.
Yeah, I'll just offer that in the 1990s, we were working on machine learning. We projected 2030 is when we would achieve parity. And as a result, we have actually seen that transition 5 years early.
Okay, fair enough. But the world is still going to hell in a handcart.
A few exceptions.
Right.
A few exceptions.
Very good. Thanks, Dr. Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
And Philip, do you have a last question here for Bill?
Yes, thank you so much, Dan, and thank you, William. It's great to listen to you and wonderful to be able to learn from you. I agree that we need to use less energy, we need to buy less stuff, and we need to seek less stimulation. I think you've referred to it a little bit, but I would like to know what you think about the value of land restoration and rewilding, and then also the value of biochar production from waste. Thank you so much.
Well, look here. I'm a population ecologist. I started studying small birds and animals, and I love the idea of rewilding. So there's no question. But the point of the matter is to get the ecosphere functioning again. What was the magic number? We need 50% of the Earth's land surface rededicated to nature. And that's simply not going to happen if we're expecting another 2 billion people. And basically moving along the same technological track that we have followed in the Western world. So it's a great idea. I just don't understand how it can happen given the nature of the world that we have created at the United Nations and every nation on the planet, where growth remains the primary goal of every government. Population growth, economic growth, material consumption is the name of our game. And in those circumstances, it seems to me the probability of significant rewilding of the planet is simply not going to happen. It should happen. It simply won't happen in current circumstances. And again, I just look at the data, the direction things are going as these parallel ideas have been out there for decades. And the ones that are winning are the growth-oriented models that suggest everybody can be raised to at least Western European material standards by the end of the century. I just don't think it can happen and have rewilding at the same time. As for biochar, honestly, it's one of the many areas I don't have sufficient knowledge to make any real comment on it, except, again, it's a scale question. If we're talking about biochar as a means of restoring carbon to the soils, if that's what you had in mind, that's one thing that people here talk about. we're putting carbon into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, at the rate of 37 billion metric tons per year, a very large proportion of which is pure carbon. So again, biochar may be a good idea to restore soil quality and so on, but it's not a solution. It's simply not quantitatively capable of
Scale,
approaching the scale needed to affect atmospheric carbon dioxide, in my humble opinion, based on almost total ignorance, I have to admit.
Right. So thanks, Philip. And Bill, thank you so much for joining us today. Fascinating, and I have to say sobering discussion, covering so much of what we cover here on Climate Chat. And I think if people are interested, they can find many more interviews with you. I've been watching your interviews for years, and so much to learn from what you've done. And again, the crazy thing is, it's kind of hard to argue with what you're saying, yet we really won't even talk about it for the most part, and it's that whole strange thing where people don't disagree with you, but they actually won't engage either on the subject because that, for whatever reason, it's not what they want to hear, I guess. But
it's been a pleasure, Dan, being with you, and thank you for the guests and excellent questions. And let's just hope things change. Look, my advice: keep your eye on the data. Never mind what the brilliant ideas are. Yes, play with them, see what might happen, urge the right things to go forward. But the fact of the matter is that many of these ideas have been around, certainly the entire 50-year academic career that I've enjoyed, and have gone nowhere in the face of the behemothhic resurgence of the growth-oriented mentality that it seems to be a universal characteristic of the human species.
Great. Thank you so much. And
pleasure.
thanks for all you've done to inform us what's going on. Really appreciate it. And thanks so much for being on Climate Chat. Please, everyone, please like, subscribe, follow, so that we can spread this conversation and the others to as many people